Hey, everybody, welcome to Red May, your 1-month vacation from capitalism. 43 events, over 110 speakers. Wow. Let me clue you into some of the things that are coming up so you can catch our last thrill-packed week. This evening at 5 p.m., counterinsurgency policing with Ameri Ochieng, Paul Passavant, Stuart Schrader, Travis Harris, Paige May, Samantha Prey-Gonzalez, and Charmaine Schwa, the moderator. Tomorrow at 11 a.m., that's Friday, Debt After Graeber, Max Haven, Cassie Thornton, Radhika Desai, Lee Claire LaBerge, and Andrew Ross. Tomorrow at 3 p.m., that's Friday, 3 p.m., What Just Happened, a review of the puzzling events of the last year, from the pandemic to the George Floyd rebellion to the Was It a Coup, analyzed by Joshua Clover, Jody Dean, Theory of Francos, Idris Robinson, and Nikhil Pal Singh. On Saturday at 10 a.m., Neither Settler Nor Native with Mahmoud Mamdani, Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, Samira Esmer, and Ted Swedenberg as the moderator. At 11 a.m. on Sunday, Rethinking the Chinese Cultural Revolution with Alexandra Russo, Andrea Piazzaroli Longobardi, and Chris Connery with Assad Haider as the moderator. And Sunday at 5 p.m., Feminist International, How to Change Everything with Veronica Gago, Michael Hart, and Kathy Weeks. At 11 a.m. on Monday, May 31st, Marx for Cats, a radical bestiary with Lee Claire LaBerge and some of her cats. So we have a lot of stuff coming up. How do we do it? Well, we do it with what you might call the value form. Now, whether you believe that money is a repertory of possible futures, as Borges says, or our passport to society, as Marx would say, we need it to keep going. We enjoy doing this month-long Madness, this totally excessive event. We want to do it next year. And amazingly, without any institutional support, we have done it for 5 years. This is our 5th year, our anniversary. We're probably going live again next year, fingers crossed. And to do that, also to fly people into Seattle, we need even more money. So go to our website, www.redmayseattle.org, and you will find a link to our GoFundMe, Fan the Flames of Red May, or you can become a patron. My Lord, I'm a patron of Red May. You can say that if you become a patron. And then you can do it at the $3, $5, $10, or $20 a month level. It's very 18th century. Anyway, lots of different ways to be part of our extended commune. But enough of that, enough crass appeals. I know you're all here to see the event, Critical Theory in the 21st Century. I'm holding up Werner Bonefeld's wonderful book on critical theory here, just to have a visual aid in this presentation. Let me introduce you to the moderator of today's event, Christian Lotz. Christian is professor of philosophy at Michigan State University, works in critical theory, Marxism, German philosophy, phenomenology, and philosophical anthropology, is of course the author of The Capitalist Schema. Christian, welcome back to Red May. And I think you're muted.
All right, now I'm unmuted. All right, thank you so much, Philip. I will be moderating this great panel today. And before we start, I just want to mention that the website description that you all saw made it sound as if we will exclusively talk about the new SAGE Handbook, of which Werner Bonefeld and Chris O'Kane are co-editors, and Amy Diaz and myself were contributors. But our speakers decided to talk more broadly about selected aspects of critical theory in the 21st century, so we will not in particular focus on that project. But before I briefly introduce our speakers, I do want to recommend the SAGE Handbook of Critical Theory to everyone. At least to my knowledge, this is the very best overview and presentation of critical theory today. It deals with figures, issues, and problems that most of the time are completely neglected and ignored by the officials of contemporary theorists in the Frankfurt School tradition. The handbook contains almost, I think, 100 chapters and appeared in 3 volumes. And I think the overall length is something like 1,600 pages. So if you are bored this summer, go through all those 3 volumes. I think Chris, Werner, and the third editor was Beverly Best. They really have done a great job putting this together. Now, let me just briefly introduce our speakers for this panel. We will first have 3 brief interventions by our speakers. Then we have a discussion among the panel, and then we can open it up to either guests that we have in the Zoom chat, or we will also monitor the chat on YouTube if you have other questions. In alphabetical order, our first panelist is Werner Bonefeld. Werner is a professor in the Department of Politics at the University of York in the UK. He is probably one of the most industrious and productive critical theorists working today. He was or is one of the main founders of open Marxism. His recent books have dealt with the role of the state in capitalism and in the ordo-liberal tradition. His probably most important book, there are 2 recent ones, but it's the one that Philip already mentioned. I can hold it in the camera. It's Critical Theory and the Critique of Political Economy. I can only recommend that to everyone. I learned a lot by reading it. Our second panelist is Amy Diaz. She's a lecturer in contemporary literature and culture at King's College in London and a poet. She is the co-editor of a poetics anthology entitled Toward Some Air. I think it appeared in 2015. And her most recent poetry publication is entitled On My Love for Gender Abolition, which appeared in 2016. As far as I understand, Amy is currently preparing a book on antagonism and abstraction in contemporary feminist poetics. Her articles deal with feminist Marxism and social reproduction theory. And I really recommend the chapter in the Sage Handbook. It's really great. Our third panelist is Chris O'Kane. Chris is currently an assistant professor in the political science department at University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley. He has written on social constitution, social domination, Marx, Adorno, Lefebvre, value form theory, and real abstraction. As far as I understand, Chris is preparing a book for the historical materialism book series that appears with Brill and Haymarket books. And he's also the editor of a forthcoming new edition of Sohn-Rethel's work in English. All right, I think we can right away go into the 3 talks. I forgot the order. Did we decide on an order, or maybe just Chris, do you want to start?
I thought the order was going to be Werner, Amy, and then myself.
Okay, that sounds good. All right, sorry for that. All right, Amy, thank you so much for everyone being here, and let's first hear the talks.
Is it Werner, then me, then Chris? Yeah, okay.
Oh, okay, sorry, my mistake again.
So you want me to start now? Or? Yeah?
Yes.
All right, very good. Right, so hello, welcome. Here I am again talking to my computer. I hopefully you can hear it. And it's clear despite my accent and tiredness. What I want to talk about is fetishism is real, says Marx, somewhere in the section on fetishism in Capital, Volume 1. And I'm asking myself throughout the talk, what actually does that mean? Fetishism is real. What therefore is real? What is real? Is it real that the invisible hand, as it were, regulates our activities? If fetishism is real, then surely it is the invisible hand. It is a reality. Maybe Hayek's term praxeology is not that far off. It is the aggregate, as it were, manifestation of all our individual activities that then commands and directs us. Competition, prices, profitability, money for the sake of more money, market value, unit labor costs, economic categories and economic quantities and their movement. And there is no profit. And if there is no profit, there is no employment. only profitable employers employ people. And employed they have to be, because they need to earn a wage to connect themselves with the means of subsistence. So that's also a reality, I guess, if fetishism is real. It's the economy stupid, as far as Bill Clinton put it in the 1990s. So here is the economy, the invisible hand, the praxeology that manifests itself behind our backs, behind the backs of what we have now become, namely participants who adjust and who react to market forces, trying desperately to make a living and to live in dignity and civility. But that, of course, is not always possible. And a profit needs to be made on the point of ruin and the pain of disaster. So fetishism is real then. Is it true that Marx then says it actually constitutes an objective illusion? What does he mean by that? I guess the two important things, at least for my talk. The first one is the world appears to us as one of economic nature. It appears to us as some sort of uncontrollable movement of economic things. Here we are, doing our best, giving it our best effort. And there we are. Our wages are cut. Our employment has ceased, despite everything we put in there. It seems almost like we are controlled by fate. Our existence seems to be fateful. It seems to be dependent on the way in which the economy moves. And yet, says Marx, that's the objectivity about it. But it's an illusion nevertheless. It is an illusion because economic nature, according to Marx's critique of fetishism, fundamentally amounts to a social nature. In other words, to a socially constituted nature. We are governed, as he puts it somewhere, it's by the products of our own hands. Secondly, and I'm talking still about objective illusion, it also means that the idea of the subject as an independent personality that is in control of things, asserts him or herself, that really is just a mere illusion. What is real? I suppose, is it not also an illusion, objective illusion, to believe that the struggle for freedom, for equality, for justice will transform capitalism, will make it better, will, as it were, realize the promise of the enlightenment, of an emancipated humanity beyond domination, exploitation, racism, anti-Semitism, discrimination on the basis of gender, ethnicity, and accent too. Might it not be the case, rather, that the demand for justice in an unjust world, that the demand for freedom in a world of unfreedom, reinforces the fundamental conditions of injustice and unfreedom? If nobody is ever again treated unfairly, unjustly, or in inverted commas, unequally on the world's labor markets, would the trade in labor power be at last fully conforming with the promise of the Eden of human rights? It might, but what is traded and why? What is the purpose of it? So to bring this initial section to the end, the humanization of the social relations is the purpose and the end of the struggle for human emancipation. And should the effort of humanizing capitalism's treatment of the worker or any other social category succeed, the better for the poor and miserable. Humanizing capitalism prevents it from descending into social catastrophe with ease. The civilized treatment of society's surplus value producers is much preferable to their uncivilized treatment. The one offers shelter, The other looks on when the poor are regulated by death. So what is real? The individuals, I've argued, act under the compulsion of abstract economic forces that seem to have a life of their own. However, if that is so, then the critique cannot therefore be one that makes individuals responsible for the relations whose creature they socially are. There might be individuals amongst us who want to, as it were, rise subjectively over and above the misery, which is good, which is great, has a wonderful civilizing effect if successful. But, let me put it differently. A humane capitalist is preferable to an inhumane capitalist. Yet both require living labor to produce a profit in order to stay in business, and only on the condition that they stay in business are they able to extend another labor contract. However, what follows from this part is that it is not sufficient to criticize capitalists for their seemingly excessive addiction to profit. Nor is it sufficient to criticize bankers for pursuing money for the sake of more money on the pain of ruin. These behaviors manifest the objective necessity of the capitalistically constituted social relations. None of us, neither capitalists nor bankers, can extricate themselves from the reality in which they live and which asserts itself not over them, not only over them, but also in and through them and by means of them. Money-making is the condition of social reproduction. So the critique, what is the methodology behind the critique of fetishism? Going to Marx, I'm following him here. It is really easy to say, we always have to have a metabolism with nature. Labor is a human necessity. So check out how the various societies, as it were, organize their labor and then, as it were, move on and to offer a more rational organization of labor. It's an ontological necessity, and capitalism is just one of them. That, he says, is not really the dialectical method or the materialism that he is after. It is much more difficult, he says, to do the opposite. And that is to develop from the actual given relations of lives the form in which these have become rigidified as forms of a seemingly natural power. So he says, these materialists who ontologize labor, they don't have an understanding of history. Their conception, in fact, excludes the historical process. So the social forces do not create the social relations, according to this. Rather, it is the social relations that create the social forces by which they are governed. What follows from this also is that society as such cannot be perceived without reference to its historical constitution, a constitution that is implicit in it. The same applies to concepts. The concept of freedom is marked by the processes of primitive accumulation that created the free laborer, the doubly free laborer. The law of value entails the force of value as its secret historical foundation. The law of value manifests the violence of the processes of primitive accumulation in the form of a freedom of economic compulsion. Here are the demands for freedom, justice, fairness. There is the freedom of economic compulsion to make money out of money on the pain of ruin. And there then is the freedom to dodge the freedom to starve by producing surplus value. enriching the capitalist, which is the condition upon which future employment and therewith wage-based access to the means of production depends. So social critique then becomes also an expression or a mouthpiece of disgust from the world as swindle. It offers freedom and recognizes freedom as economic compulsion. So let's put it differently. Civil rights are worth fighting for, to attain and to treasure and to protect. But what good does it do if a Black American is now allowed to eat in a previously white-only restaurant if she can't afford to pay? The next quotation I have is from Marx also, and this is it. To be a productive laborer is not a piece of luck, but a great misfortune. Even worse, I guess, it is to be an unproductive laborer. That's not a piece of luck either. It also is a great misfortune. An expenditure of living labor that fails to make a profit is an expenditure of unnecessary social labor. And it is such, it is an expenditure of redundant social labor. It produces surplus citizens. There is then a fate far worse than a fate than being exploited. And that is to be an unexploitable laborer. How to make a living without wage income? What is the price of a kidney? And how often can you sell it? Where to migrate to find work, whatever kind? How many for prostitution? What is real? That's how I started. Let's check it out again. Only that labor in capitalism is productive, which contributes to the valorization of value. Labor either yields more money or it does not, in which case it is socially speaking redundant. No wonder, therefore, that the buyers of labor power see living labor as a mere human resource, mere human material. Their capital value depends on making a profit to avoid bankruptcy, to avoid liquidation. Profit really is not the end. Profit is the means of staying afloat, of beating the competition, of avoiding competitive erosion. And the laborer depends on the profitability of his or her labor. As I said earlier, only profitable capitalists employ labor. Unprofitable ones shed labor. They make labor redundant. What is real also is that the increase in the productivity of labor reduces the employment of labor relative to machinery. The increase in labor productivity increases or creates surplus populations, the so-called industrial reserve army of labor. So the freedom of labor is the freedom of trade in labor power, and what, given the normative ideals of justice, liberty, equality, how should this trade in labor power be organized to look like? How should it look like so that the economic compulsion to make a living as a human resource of profit ceases, and that society's surplus value producers have therefore no longer to chew their words to fill their bellies? Capital, my next quote, is just a name. I got that from the Grundrisse. So if it's just a name, then I suppose it is the name of a particularly constituted society, of the relations of that society. And I'll start this section by referring back to Marx's critique of Proudhon. In Marx's critique, it was very simple. He says Proudhon substituted the critique of capital for the critique of the capitalist, seeking to free capital from the capitalist so as to utilize the power of capital for the benefit of a prosperous society. Proudhon's idea persists to this day in the form of social democracy, progressivism, and in the form of various social movements for justice, freedom, and fairness. These movements both identify the existing conditions of misery, and they make it seem as if misery is a mere pathology of capitalist society. It can be taken care of. That is at least the implication or the suggestion. All would be well if only government were to stand up to the capitalist interests, and instead governs in the interests of the many, the 99%. The illusion here says that the profitable accumulation of money that yields more money does not really count. What counts is the satisfaction of human needs. It says that the failure to make a profit entails no threat to social reproduction. What counts is not profit, but human beings and their satisfaction. It suggests that the life of the class of surplus value producers does not hang by the success of turning their labor into profit, as the fundamental condition of achieving wage-based access to the means of life. What counts is goodness. So it rejects as absurd that useful things that cannot be turned into profit are burned. What counts is use value production. It rejects as unfounded the insight that in the capitalist society, the needs of human beings, the satisfaction of human beings is never more than a sideshow. So it opposes money making. Instead, it considers money as a means of purchasing commodities. And it demands that money be put into the pockets of the workers, the miserable, the poor, the disenfranchised, to strengthen their purchasing power, connecting them more firmly to the means of subsistence. However, and nevertheless, the exchange of labor power for money that is then exchanged for the means of subsistence is a function of profit making. Profitable employers purchase labor power. Unprofitable employers do not. Profit is a means of avoiding bankruptcy, and for the sake of sustained access to the means of subsistence, the sellers of labor power depend for their life on the profitable exploitation of their living labor. So the illusion that I have portrayed and caricatured, the illusion identifies what really matters. Nobody should ever go hungry again. But it does not grasp what it identifies. What is real? In itself, I argue, the dispossessed struggle for access to the means of subsistence, to satisfy their needs. They struggle for wages and conditions. They struggle against Moneybags' werewolf hunger for surplus labor and its destructive conquest for additional atoms of unpaid labor time. And they struggle thus against the reduction of their life to a mere time's carcass. They struggle against a life constituting solely of labor power, consisting solely of labor time, and thus against a reduction of human life to a mere economic resource. They struggle for respect, education, recognition of human significance, and above all for food, shelter, clothing, warmth, love, affection, knowledge, time for enjoyment and dignity, and running toilet water too. The dispossessed do not struggle for socialism. They struggle for crude material things. They struggle to make a living. They do all this in conditions in which the increase in wealth that their labor produces pushes beyond the limits of its capitalist form, profitability. And every so-called trickle-down effect that capitalist accumulation might bring forth presupposes a prior and sustained trickle-up in the capitalist accumulation of wealth. And then society suddenly finds itself again put back into a state of momentary barbarism. It appears as if famine, a universal war of devastation, had cut off the supply of every means of subsistence, as Marx and Engels put it in the Communist Manifesto. And there we are. What is real? What is real is that the struggle of the dispossessed does not express an ontological privilege. It is dictated by hunger. The class antagonism belongs to the concept of capital. And so does the class struggle to civilize capitalism's treatment of its workers. What is real, therefore, is human suffering as the hidden secret of the economic quantities that assert themselves in the form of ghost-walking economic forces. And yet, their reality is a human reality. In capitalism, says Marx, man is governed by the products of her own hand. And that is me. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Werner, for this first intervention. As I said at the beginning, we have a discussion after we hear all three talks. So I guess then Amy would be our next speaker.
Thank you, Christian. So hi everyone, thanks for that paper, Werner, and to the Red May organisers too for what must be a phenomenal amount of work to put this together. It's a fantastic programme, and thank you to everyone for coming and listening today as well. My paper is, I think, connects up in some ways to Werner's. It's an attempt to distill and organise some ideas I'm trying to develop for a short book I'm writing with Nat Hurley and Sean O'Brien. Our book is called Antisocial Reproduction. That's the title of my paper as well. And our concept seeks to develop the critical categories necessary for an era in which capital needs the worker and her labour less and less, where the wage no longer sustains the proletariat, where reproduction often takes the form of unwaged or informally waged survival. The idea of antisocial reproduction then is informed, especially in Sean's chapter, by analyses that explain why the value abstraction remains dominant even when the demand for labour begins to decline. Even and especially through periods of crisis such as our own, in which circuits of circulation and circuits of reproduction become disaggregated. But antisocial reproduction is intended as a polyvalent term, which for my co-authors and I also invokes the centrality of the negative in queer theory's antisocial term. And there's a striking comparison to be made here between critical theory's entirely negative concept of class, in which class identity can only ever be tied to capital's abstract domination, and the importance of negativity in the queer antisocial thesis, where, as Robin Wiegmann explains, and I'm quoting her now, negativity signifies a resistance to or undoing of the stabilizing frameworks of coherence imposed on thought and lived experience. As such, it is not a negation of the social, but an intrinsic part of it, which makes negativity a crucial resource for social theory, not its quietistic, apolitical, nihilist, or defeatist foe. And Wiegmann is drawing on Lauren Berlant and Lee Edelman there. There are, of course, some distinctions to be drawn out regarding how critical theory and queer theory each conceptualize the social. In queer theory, the social is inscribed with the antisocial refusal to redeem or civilize sexuality, meaning that the social persists under threat of its own dissolution, while in the Frankfurt school tradition, it describes those human activities mediated by exchange. But I think an insistence on the negative as internal to the social in both discourses marks what they have in common as attempts to critique the violent processes that undergird forms of positive representation, abstract equality before the law, the rights-bearing citizen, and so on. So in this vein, my own chapter, for which Nat and Sean should not be held responsible yet, makes a case for a value theoretical approach to social reproduction in an attempt to demonstrate how feminized forms of reproduction are linked to the negativity at the heart of the value form. And I think what Maya Gonzalez calls the hidden abode of reproduction usefully denotes the illegibility of a substratum of activities and processes that either cannot be rationalized and measured or are not worth it from capital's viewpoint, and must therefore be disavowed, displaced, sublated. And this negativity too is internal to the contradiction that characterizes the commodity, which appears to quite impossibly function as use value and exchange value at the same time. So the term antisocial reproduction also invokes, of course, the new discourse of social reproduction theory, or SRT. And part of my aim here is to provide an alternative to what I would call the labor ontological model of social reproduction theory. And this model, I want to argue, is methodologically unable to center analyses of gay and trans social reproduction, of capitalist crises, both of value production and of labor, and analysis of the ongoing reproduction that takes place in the spaces abjected by capital's circuits. So I'll begin here with the critique of SRT. In 2017, a new collection of essays, Social Reproduction Theory, Remapping Class, Recentering Oppression, was published by Pluto Press. Edited by Tithi Bhattacharya and with a foreword by Lise Vogel, the collection marks a resurgence of interest in Marxist feminist analyses following the 2008 credit crash. Its stated objectives situate it at the centre of a burgeoning field of social reproduction feminism, debated in the pages of Viewpoint, Verso, the Pluto blog, and the journals Historical Materialism and Science and Society. In a video introducing the collection, Bhattacharya explains, social reproduction theory asks the question, if workers produce commodities, who produces the worker? So social reproduction theory is really about the social processes that produce labour power as a commodity and how the production of labour power is connected to and imbricated with the social processes that produce other commodities. So social reproduction theory's methodologies and operative concepts are most promising, I think, where, as in this formulation, they attend to the relationship between the abstract and the concrete. Indeed, Bhattacharya is most compelling when she suggests how, quote, the process of accumulation seeks to organize and shape social categories of race, sexuality, and gender. Or, as another leading theorist of social reproduction, Cinzia Arruzza, puts it, quote, the logic of capitalism is pervasive. That is, it has the capacity of coloring all other social relationships, which is one of the grounds for speaking of a contradictory and articulated moving totality, end quote. And I think formulations like these helpfully avoid economistic understandings of capitalist domination, which tend to miss that economic relations are social relations. But SRT is more often emphatically economistic. In her own essay from the Social Reproduction Theory collection, How Not to Skip Class, Bhattacharya argues that non-wage social relations are formed in response to capital labour relations. She writes, the social relations outside of wage labour are not accidental to it, but take specific historical form in response to it. For instance, the gendered nature of reproduction of labour power has conditioning impulses for the extraction of surplus value. Similarly, the heterosexist form of the family unit is sustained by capital's needs for the generational replacement of the labour force, end quote. This is a confusing statement, I think. Marx's presentation in Capital of a dialectical unity of production and circulation is displaced here by a unity of production and reproduction. For Bhattacharya, the wage relation gives form to gendered social reproduction, but gendered reproduction also conversely conditions labour power, or the processes through which surplus value is extracted. And I point to this semblance of a dialectical totality because I believe it's symptomatic of a conceptual limit point native to social reproduction theory, which finds its analytical basis in an investigation of, quote, the relationship between processes of producing human labour power and processes of producing value, end quote, and thus consistently emphasises labour power as the pivot point between production and reproduction. The methodological centrality of labour power in social reproduction feminism brings with it analytical and political problems. Indeed, SRT's figuration of reproduction as a precondition for production requires that it retain a rigid conceptual distinction between productive and reproductive, a distinction asserted in Bhattacharya's note that, quote, capitalism generates a set of two distinct relations that are nevertheless unified, the particular relations that adhere to production and to reproduction. But this distinction is not self-evident, and as Bhattacharya herself notes, quote, the two processes may be ongoing within the same space. For Marx, production is a moment in the larger process of social reproduction, and as the Endnotes Collective has shown, drawing a clean line between production and reproduction results in the kind of empiricism that he was at pains to critique, quote, because what we are trying to name cannot be defined as a specific set of activities according to their use value or concrete character. So while we might identify concrete activities as messy or sensuous reproductive tasks, doing so tells us little about their structural relationship to capital, since these tasks might well be mediated by a wage. Why then does SRT retain the production-reproduction binary? For a few reasons I want to suggest, but methodologically because SRT, in Bhattacharya's rendering at least, is based on a workerist position that ontologizes labour as the basis of all societies, including capitalism. She argues that, quote, Marx's understanding of the theatre of capitalism as a totality is important because at this point in the argument in Capital Volume 1, Marx has already established that, unlike bourgeois economics, which sees the commodity as the central character of this narrative, supply and demand dictate the market. In his view, in Marx's view, labour is capitalism's chief protagonist. Thus, what happens to labour, specifically how labour creates value and consequently surplus value, shapes the entirety of the capitalist process of production, end quote. This notion of the shaping role of labour, as it mediates a totality of social reproduction, builds on Marx's idea of labour as the living, form-giving fire. It means that despite the gesture to a dialectical unity of production and reproduction, a misleading trope in any case, labour is given centre stage as the protagonist of capitalism, while reproduction takes form in response to production. Basing a theory of social reproduction on labour brings other political problems too, not least of which is SRT's tendency to figure the disruption of reproduction as merely a route to disrupting the production of the waged worker. Bhattacharya entrenches this ordering gesture when she draws on Raymond Williams' 1981 observation regarding race and gender-based struggles that, quote, there is not one of these issues which, followed through, fails to lead us into the central systems of the industrial capitalist mode of production, end quote. In this way, SRT engages a very similar kind of flattening or universalizing gesture to that which traditional Marxism performs when it affirms the waged worker as the revolutionary subject. Moreover, SRT's narrow focus on reproduction as work or unpaid labour and on the family unit, even in its queer iterations, ends up making social reproduction struggles occupy the form of workerist struggles. It ends up obscuring other forms of antisocial, non-familial, trans and queer reproduction and risks reinscribing the colonial and heteronormative forms it seeks to critique. In part, this arises from SRT's tendency to examine reproduction in terms that nearly always translate to the expressly concrete, the embodied, the biological, the physical and arduous tasks of cooking, cleaning and caring, whether in the frame of a single household or in the context of global migration and labour patterns. Like Silvia Federici's hopes for the kitchen commons, there's a whiff of earthy moralism about this, I think, as the sensuous is opposed to the abstract in implicitly ethical terms. The centrality of labour in social reproduction theory is part and parcel of a political commitment to an argument about labour as a potential. Bhattacharya argues that, quote, only a struggle of worker insurgency will have the power to rupture capital's hidden abode and return the control of our sensuous, tactile, creative capacity to labour to where it truly belongs, to ourselves, end quote. What's not stated here, though it's implicit in the conflation of labour and ourselves as one and the same thing, the place where our capacity belongs, is a view of labour as ontological, a natural activity common to all societies, as opposed to a social relation and an abstraction specific to capitalism. This transhistorical view confuses labour in capitalism with labour in general. It forgets the fact that, as Moshe Postone has pointed out, it's only because labour and commodities are accorded their social character indirectly in capitalism that they acquire two dimensions in the first place. SRT does not pursue the abolition of labour, but its reorganisation. And what disappears in this view is the thought of a world where the distinction between labour and non-labour no longer exists. A critique of antisocial reproduction, on the other hand, begins from the premise that the most fundamental organising force of social reproduction in capitalism is not labour, but the value abstraction. Social reproduction is both a question of abstraction considered in terms of abstract social relations and their mediations, and abstraction in its unmasked sense, in the sense of extraction, removal, or disposal. Bhattacharya claims that SRT, quote, reveals the essence category of capitalism, its animating force, to be human labour and not commodities, end quote. But while labour is certainly capitalism's animating force, insofar as it's the only way in which surplus value can be produced, capitalism's essence category is not an essence at all. It's the empty abstraction we call value. Marx's famous description of labour as the living, form-giving fire, the transitoriness of things, their temporality as their formation by living time, already suggests what his analysis in Capital will more explicitly argue, which is that it's precisely the abstract nature of value, its emptiness as a form without essence or content, that enables capital to move itself, to act as the self-expanding, automatic subject of impersonal compulsions. Value thus takes multiple forms of appearance, as money and as various types of commodities, including labour power, assuming and shedding forms as it expands through the circuit of accumulation. What does this mean for a critique of reproduction and feminization? As much of our audience today will know, Alfred Sohn-Rethel first theorized this movement of capital using the concept of real abstraction, underlining Marx's point in Capital that the exchange abstraction arises not through thought, but through people's actions, thus arising behind their backs. For Sohn-Rethel, real abstraction comes about by force of the action of exchange. And in this sense, the abstraction of exchange value is the logical kernel organizing what he calls the social synthesis. We could contrast this to Moishe Postein's thesis that real abstraction first emerges not in the exchange relation, but from the way in which concrete and abstract labor reciprocally determine each other. But without getting into the details of that disagreement, we can observe that for Postein, as for Sohn-Rethel, it's the abstract, which is to say the relational, shape-shifting and non-cognitive character of value that allows it to pass itself off as a natural category, and one that peddles other abstractions too. In Sohn-Rethel's account, quote, use value becomes a matter of ideal representation and thus turns out to be abstract. And in Postein's, quote, the self-grounding moment of labour and capitalism imparts an objective character to labour. The question of whether capitalist abstractions emerge from the petrifications of exchange or the mediations of labour is in the end moot, since as both Michael Heinrich and Joshua Clover have pointed out, the logic of capital presupposes a contradictory unity of production and circulation. The point is that capitalist abstractions make the concrete abstract too. Realisms and mediations of capitalist abstractions dialectically cast supposedly non-abstract qualities and processes into abstractions too, I want to argue, is crucial for theories of social reproduction, where categories like use value and concrete labour might be substituted for other supposedly concrete qualities like gender or race. What precisely is abstract about them though? And what does that mean, not only for how we might reconfigure theories of social reproduction, but for how we engage in social reproduction struggles? Along with the concept of real abstraction, new readings of Marx provide other useful conceptual tools that can help us to think about how social reproduction is shaped globally and intimately. From Diane Elson's value theory of labour, which explains how value as a one-sided and apparently independent abstraction socially fixes labour, to the concept of form determination developed in the new readings of Marx and in my co-panellist Chris O'Kane's work, to my other co-panellist Werner Bonefeld's argument that the law of value depends on another constitutive presupposition, that of the system of permanent primitive accumulation, which develops on the logic and by the force of, he argues, the continual separation of the proletarian from her means of reproduction in a process of dispossession and class antagonism. This is the reproduction of a generalized dependence on the wage that must be re-established at every moment. Perhaps the most important insight that theories of value and abstraction bring to theories of social reproduction is that the times and spaces of social reproduction do not, structurally speaking, constitute an outside capital accumulation conceived as the totality of value relations, even if they constitute an outside to value production. Rather, they're more darkly imbricated with accumulation than we might think. And my basic claim in my chapter, to return to my opening comments, is that what is antisocial about social reproduction is internal to it. What is antisocial about social reproduction is also, therefore, what is social about it. And if such claims appear to hew too close to the sort of naysaying nihilism of which communization theory is regularly accused, then it's also worth underlining their dialectical implications. If we understand real abstraction as an antisocial process of reduction or extraction, as an emptying out of the particulars of complex social processes that makes history appear as the linear movement of natural ideal forms, then it's also true that these capitalist forms and categories are themselves thoroughly social, since they're constituted through the very social processes they obscure. Beginning with the category of value rather than labour is thus not simply a matter of theoretical fine-tuning, but a point of feminist critique. A Marxian critique of antisocial reproduction might persuasively draw on a long history of work in feminist and queer theory to denaturalize gender and sex. It also casts doubt upon Bhattacharya's common sense assertion that, quote, the wage labour relation suffuses the spaces of non-waged everyday life, end quote, because a critique of antisocial reproduction gets us closer to an understanding of how the spaces of non-waged everyday life are differentially suffused, often to the point of not being suffused at all. Instead, these spaces are abandoned by capital. Its shaping force is felt only negatively. And as a critique of value, I think this gets us closer to comprehending what's really antisocial about social reproduction writ large, which is the fact that the messy, sensuous, gendering, racializing, violent and deathly processes of social reproduction are shaped and delimited by abstractions which have no essential content, but nevertheless constitute, to borrow Marx's ironic reference to money, the real community. Thank you for listening. That's the end of my talk.
Yeah, thank you so much, Amy. Our third speaker is Chris O'Kane. Chris.
Well, thanks, Christian. Thanks to everyone who's come. Thanks to the organizers of Red May. I guess I have the unenviable task of trying to finish out this panel following these two wonderful and rich papers. And the way that I'm going to try and do that is by sort of drawing them together and talking about sort of critical theory, theories of crisis, permanent catastrophe, and sort of with a mind to this question of, I guess, what is the role, what might be the importance of critical theory in the 21st century. And I'm going to read it. It is a commonplace to say that the 2008 crisis has led to a revival of interest in Marx, and with it, the revitalization of the left. At the same time, the period since 2008 has been characterized as one of crisis or one of crises. And this has led a number of thinkers to argue that one of Marx's crisis theories can explain our current moment, to draw on Marxian thinkers to analyze a crisis of neoliberal hegemony or of political legitimacy, or to develop theories of the systematic or multifaceted economic, ecological, reproductive, and political crises we now face from the perspective of their overcoming. Yet as far as I know, nobody has investigated the character of this revival of Marx, nor of these theories of crisis, nor how they pertain to capitalism and its overcoming. Finally, nobody, with the exception of Christos Mimos's forthcoming or very recently published book, has considered how Frankfurt School critical theory and the idea of permanent catastrophe pertains to these issues. So in my talk today, I intend to do both in a provocative manner by drawing on some of the fundamental ideas of an approach to Frankfurt School critical theory that has been developed by Werner, the authors in the aforementioned Sage Handbook of Frankfurt School critical theory, and the authors of the Critical Theory and Critique of Society book series, and in a number of my own articles. Rather than sort of citing them or diving into them, I sort of draw on them. Although I see most of the people attending the talk in the Zoom room, may sort of expect a more academic approach. So if people sort of are interested in these articles that this talk is based on, just go ahead and email me and I'll be happy to send you a copy. Anyway, this approach conceives of the early Frankfurt School of Adorno, Horkheimer, Benjamin, and others as expounding a heterodox Marxist critique of traditional theory and a critical theory of capitalist society. Elements of which have been echoed and further developed by thinkers who are not seen as Frankfurt School critical theorists, due to the association and the development of Frankfurt School critical theory with figures such as Jürgen Habermas, Axel Honneth, and their interlocutors. So first, I'm going to sort of outline the distinction between traditional and critical theory and traditional and critical Marxism in these approaches. And then on this basis, I will sort of argue that with the exception of communization theory, that the revival of interest in Marx and theories of crisis that draw on these understandings of Marx propose to overcome these crises by unwittingly developing a more progressive type of capitalism. And this is because, I claim not only is the Marx that is the object of this revival and development a traditional interpretation of Marx, but it is also because the ideas of capitalism, crisis, and democratic socialism that are part of these interpretations and theories are traditional theories. And then in distinction, I will sort of outline a critical theory of the reproduction of the negative totality of capitalist society as one of permanent catastrophe. And I hope that in doing this, I will point to the importance of Frankfurt School critical theory in the 21st century. Now, according to Horkheimer and Adorno, traditional theory was a normative and diagnostic theory, one that proceeded from an enlightened standpoint within the capitalist division of labor that sought to further its progressive development by determining how different social ills could be remedied by the norms and the institutions of modern society. The critical theory of society, on the other hand, conceived of domination and suffering as intrinsic to the negative totality of capitalist society, including the economy, the state, and the family, premised on the external and the internal domination of nature. Later thinkers, who are often grouped in value form theory or the new reading of Marx, developed an interpretation of the critique of political economy as a critical social theory. These interpreters of Marx oppose this critical theory interpretation of Marx and of the critique of political economy in particular to traditional Marxism. Like traditional theory, traditional Marxism proceeded from a standpoint within capitalist society. In this case, the standpoint of labor served as the criterion to critique the unfair distribution of property and wealth. Socialism, in contrast, was conceived as the realization of labor via the dictatorship of the proletariat through the public ownership of property and the proceeds of labor. The critical theory interpretation of the critique of political economy, on the other hand, held that capitalism was a historically specific negative totality, and that socialism could only be achieved by the emancipatory abolition of the state, the economy, and labor. Now, of course, time and space certainly prevents a thorough recapitulation of the reception of Marx from 2000 to the present, and of the crisis theories associated with this Marx reception. Nonetheless, I will contend that the early reception of Marx, around 2008, Occupy, the UK student movement, the movement of the squares, brought together the insights of value form theory, communization theory, and notions of a secular crisis. But following the ebb of this cycle of struggles, this reception of Marx was superseded by a traditional interpretation of Marx and the development of theories, of a number of theories of crisis. In this perspective, the 2008 crisis may have been resolved by the government bailout of the banks, but it had been displaced into crises of neoliberal political legitimacy, into austerity, into crises of social reproduction. Coupled with the pressing issue of climate change and the rise of democratic socialism, this set the stage for a number of theories of capitalism and crisis that drew on and extended Marx in order to conceive of neoliberal capitalist profits as responsible for these crises of democracy, of social reproduction, and of nature. Now, a number of approaches and a number of thinkers have developed interpretations of Marx and interpretations of particular crises on this basis. While others, such as Jason E. Moore and Raj Patel and Nancy Fraser, have developed synthetic theories of the multiple crisis tendencies in all of these spheres. Now, my contention is that these theories of capitalism, crisis, and socialism rely on traditional interpretations of Marx to formulate these theories of capitalism, crisis, and socialism. And this is because these theories essentially amount to a critique of distribution from the standpoint of labor within the capitalist division of labor. Neoliberal capitalist profits have been made possible by the exploitation of productive and reproductive labor, of the misrule of the democratic institutions of the state in favor of private rather than public interests, and the non-sustainable plunder of nature. But these theories hold that these crises can be remedied by the democratic socialist rule of the state. If the state represents the will of the laboring public, ensuring the social surplus is fairly and justly distributed in a sustainable manner. However, while such a society would undoubtedly be more progressive than ours, such a notion of capitalism, crisis, and socialism imply the perpetuation of capitalist society on the basis of these traditional theoretical ideas. So this raises the question, right? Would the alternative to these traditional theories of crisis then be a critical theory of crisis? And this is a question I've been thinking about for quite some time. My answer to that now is no, right? And I think the reason it is no is implied in a point from Simon Clark from Marx's theory of crisis, where he sort of argues in the conclusion that Marx does not so much offer a theory of crisis as a fundamentally different foundation for the analysis of the capitalist economy from that on which bourgeois economics is built. And this foundation is provided by the investigation of the social form of capitalist production, which Clark argues leads to a specific characterization of the dynamics of the capitalist mode of production as a crisis-ridden dynamic of permanent class struggle. In other words, in order for a critical theory of society to be critical of that society, it needs to hold that the organization of that society is inherently dominating, antagonistic, and miserable. On this basis, Adorno holds that historical development should not be seen in conjunctures or cycles of boom and bust, but as permanent catastrophe. Thus, following Benjamin, that things just go on as the catastrophe. Thus, hell is not something that awaits us, but this life here and now. Now, in the last section, I just want to sort of indicate why and how a Marxian critical theory that draws together these insights from Clark and Adorno, might be said to sort of hold this view and how it might be sort of developed from a present vantage point. Now, in the first place, as I mentioned, sort of this approach to critical theory conceives of capitalist society as a historically specific negative totality, right? So from this perspective, as Adorno says, society is understood as a sort of linking structure between human beings in which everything and everyone depend on everyone and everything, where the whole is only sustained by the unity of the functions fulfilled by all its members, and each single one of these members is in principle assigned such a function. But at the same time, each individual is determined to a great degree by his membership in this total structure. Thus, as Werner and Amy have indicated, the institutions and social relations that make up the society, the economy, the state, the household, are all the negative moments that are a part of reproducing this whole. And such a society is not characterized by the capturing of the proceeds of productive and reproductive labor by capital, but rather the historically specific form of the productive and of productive and reproductive labor, of the state, and of this negative totality, where the whole subsists through its parts and individuals serve as functions of these parts. So from this perspective, the productive labor of the economy is realized in a crisis-ridden dynamic that maims and displaces a labor force that overproduces goods for the sake of profit. The reproductive bureaucracies of the state, as well as the household and family, socialize, dominate, and sustain social individuals as bearers of the commodity labor power, instilling them with respect for authority and the cutthroat attitude to compete with each other to get ahead in the rat race. Reproductive labor does not then consist, as Sue Ferguson argues, in the desired human qualities and capacities that reproductive labor creates that are taken advantage of by capitalists, but instead reproductive labor produces and reproduces a class of workers separated from the means of their own reproduction, who compete with each other to sell their labor power as a commodity on the labor market, which establishes the value of the commodity of labor power. Those who are lucky enough to obtain work are part of what Marx calls the crippled monstrosity known as the collective worker. Those who are not subjected to a dominating bureaucracy are subjected to a dominating bureaucracy, which keeps down the wage. Moreover, in rearing new generations to be bearers of the commodity labor power, these institutions socialize young people so that they show an inclination to submit to any authority, no matter what its content, as long as this offers them protection, narcissistic satisfaction, material gain, and also the possibility to release upon others the sadism behind which their unconscious perplexity and desperation are hidden. Reproductive labor instills and sustains the qualities and capacities integral to reproducing a society premised on separation and main subjectivity. Here, as Marx indicates, the dull compulsion of economic categories are supplemented by the advance of capitalist production and reproduction, which develops a working class which by education, tradition, and habit looks upon the conditions of that mode of production as self-evident laws of nature, leading to the reproduction of the negative totality of capitalist society, an antagonistic and all-around dependency premised on the domination of external and internal nature. From this, it follows that in the second place, historical development is not characterized by more progressive eras and less progressive ones, based on the balance of class forces. Neoliberalism is not then the antithesis of Keynesianism. Rather, Keynesianism consisted in the integration and depoliticization of the workers' movement. Neoliberalism consists in continued depoliticization and integration in the context of a disintegration in living standards. Whatever comes next, be it more neoliberalism, be it post-Keynesianism, be it even democratic socialism, proposes to perpetuate these social relations and institutions. These policies may resolve crises, but they will perpetuate unfreedom as permanent catastrophe. Now, such a picture of society and historical development will no doubt seem pessimistic to some of you, perhaps even nihilistic leftism to others of you. And pessimism is indeed a classic charge against critical theory. Yet I think it is an important distinction has to be made between pessimism and negativity. For the critical theory of society would not be critical of society if it simply held that this is the way things are and will continue to be. This would simply be a fatalistic theory of human nature, which would certainly lead to pessimism. But fatalism and pessimism are different than a theory that accentuates the negativity of our capitalist society. In fact, they are the opposite. Negativity aims to liberate us from a society in which we are fated to work, to suffer, to be miserable, to revile, instrumentalize, and act antagonistically towards others, towards nature, and towards ourselves in order to merely survive. It does so by showing how the social relations and institutions that make up our present society manifest themselves in this manner. Universal history of the history of development of the society is thus, as Adorno says, to be construed and denied. In so doing, it points to the necessity of the emancipatory abolition of these social relations and of these institutions in order to end the fate that befalls us in this social reality. And it holds that these processes can happen at any time. This process is of emancipatory abolition. For a society premised on freedom and human flourishing will not come about by the democratic redistributing of the proceeds of toil and misery of our unfree society. In my view, that is pessimistic. And it points to the validity of a critical theory in a time when the catastrophes that have occurred and those that are to come make any further waiting seem absurd. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you so much to all of our speakers, Werner, Amy, and Chris. Just to mention the procedure again, all of those who are part of the Zoom meeting can raise their hand if they have a question. We will also monitor the YouTube live chat if there are questions. And before we do that, before we take questions from those audiences, I want to give everyone on the panel, which means Amy, Werner, and Chris, the chance to react or raise questions to each other. And for that, you would simply need to unmute yourself and jump in.
I could maybe begin with, well, a question for Chris and Werner about this question of Werner's, what is real? And Werner concluded by making the point that what's real is human suffering, of course, which is a really great way of putting it. And I wondered, I hope this isn't too tangential to your talk, Werner, but I wonder what you make of, or whether you would be able to comment on, or perhaps Chris would comment on this too, attempts to synthesize the kind of Marxian critical theory we're talking about here with maybe psychoanalytic concepts or other concepts drawn from discourses which are perhaps quite distant in some ways from the critique that we're trying to practice here. So I'm thinking perhaps of Frederick Jameson's move in that long first chapter in The Political Unconscious to argue that we can use transhistorical concepts drawn from psychoanalysis at the local level. Of course, they are subsumed within his historical horizons, but this also ties to Beverly Best's arguments, recent arguments perhaps around a neutral concept of ideology and a critical concept of ideology, and her point that we need both of those to think about culture or about ideology. And I'd be really interested to hear thoughts from you both on that following those papers. That's a massive question too, so no problem if you want to pass.
I want to do two things. I want to pass and provide a response. So I'm not familiar with the literatures that you are referring to. But what I would like to say is how I came to suffering is the new Marx lecture is very logical. No? How do things sit together, and what is the logic of the matter, what is the systematicity of the matter. That's all very good, it's very helpful, helped me a lot. But it must mean something for people too who live it. And what does it mean for people? And there is something quite corporeal around it, I think, something quite bodily, the experience of real abstraction. And I also came to this from the side of class and struggle. And it's quite, what does it actually mean? And if it is not struggle for something, it's like beyond, transcendent, if it has no telos, as it were, what is it all about? What do these people do? And clearly, if you read Marx's Capital in terms of what does it mean for the people, what is the experience of it for those who do the acting, as it were, the so-called agents, what does it mean for them? Then clearly you realize to be human material entails struggle. You against it, you want to shorten the working day, you want a tea break, you want a proper wage. And at the same time, the contradiction is, of course, despite all of that, you need that employment, because otherwise, what do you do? So there's the contradiction there. You want to do as little work as possible, but you do want to work for your employment. And the work is only forthcoming if your labor produces a profit. And this contradiction is in fact a contradiction not between capital and labor, as it was traditionally seen, but is in fact a contradiction that pertains to the concept of what it means to be a worker. And I came to suffering, as it were, from that perspective. Whatever the logic of the matter, it's not out there, it exists through people. And it's the people who act who endow that logic with a will and a consciousness. So that's how I came to it. So I gave you half an answer. I can't comment on the literature that you raised. I don't know it, or I know too little about it in order to say anything sensible, or to say it is with confidence. But I told you how I came to it.
I guess my answer would just be, I absolutely do think that psychoanalysis is important to developing critical theory, particularly in, if we're talking about misery, sort of the misery of the society that we live in, I think is inflicted in multiple ways, which also has to do with sort of the formation and the development of subjectivity. And I think I sort of hinted at that a little in the dense paragraph I read, in terms of sort of this process of socialization, this process of sort of reproductive labor. What does it mean for the development of subjectivity for concepts and theories of care to sort of raise people in a world in which they have to compete with each other in order to work, in order to live. And I think that can't just be answered with sort of the right interpretation of where surplus value is created. I think that has to sort of be developed by drawing on a number of different tools. And indeed, if we go back to early critical theory, that is exactly what they did.
Mm. Thank you, Chris. This also maybe comes back to the point about a point you both made about value being the result of human social practice, which is so often a point missed, or a kind of accusation thrown at this kind of critical theory perhaps, is that it's not about humans in any way. Thanks.
Any other intervention from the panel?
Again, I just want to say, two great talks. Thanks very much.
Maybe I can also jump in. I have a question for Werner first. I mean, when you started out, I found it kind of interesting because I thought, wow, he's sort of talking about what's real and what is not real. And he started out with the fetishism. And I think one reading of this entire objective quality of fetishism somehow means that the society in its reality is not transparent to the agents, right? That's at least one easy way to understand the fetishism on a first level. And I wonder how you think about that. So, I mean, that always drives me back to sort of like at least a Lukács position. Is it possible for a particular group or class in this society to break through the fetishism because they, so to speak, see or can have access to the reality? And if this is not the case, as far as I remember from your critical theory book, you do not seem to be in favor of that. How do you think this obfuscation can ever be broken through?
Well, that is the question fundamentally, I guess, about how to move from here to there. Who is the agent? and I don't know. I mean, if I were to know, I would have told everybody already. Often I would be a prophet of some sort. No? But God knows what the future will hold. What is important to understand what is wrong with the world, and not knowing how to set the world right doesn't make the wrong, as it were, superfluous. It strengthens the character of what is wrong in that world. How to break through it? I guess in the struggle for subsistence, there's also an experience of the world that does not fit with the self-presentation of the world. There's a contradiction there. There are frictions there. There are openings there, and these are the openings or the breaks or the fissures, as it were, that provides hope in inverted commas, of politicization, of difference, of movement. So the experience of the world is not, there was another economic quantity that walked past me driven by the invisible hand. The experience of the world is, this is bloody awful. This is contradictory. I did put a great job here and I'm unemployed. And then is the question how that translates itself. Does it translate itself entirely in me adjusting to the world, becoming a carrier self-consciously of human capital? Or does it translate itself into actions of solidarity, of alternative ways of social reproduction? And I guess for most people, it's both at the same time. And the question really is, what are the frictions? What are the contradictions? What are the antinomies? And what is the ability of those to politicize social relations, to march constantly, as it were? I think in the politicization of society lies the key for its transformation. But that depends on the experience of the frictions, the contradictions, and that the unfairness of the world is an unfairness that is systematic rather than individual shortcoming, as it were. I'm not sure I gave you an answer, but that is the way I like to think about it.
Well, that strikes me a little bit Lukácsian, at least, or you're moving towards that, because, the Lukács question is there anyone who has, so to speak, a privileged epistemic access to the reality? And on the one hand, it can be the theorist. The critical theorist must somehow make a claim to have access to that reality by theorizing about it. And then there's, of course, the other side, or there's the other question, namely, are there certain agents in society, or when they become agents, do they then have a privileged epistemic access to the reality? And it sounds now as if you want to say something like that, namely through certain experiences and through certain agencies, wherever they come from, that epistemic position can be developed, and thereby, so to speak, the fetishism can be, well, how should we say that? We can break through that on the ground without theorizing here in a Zoom meeting. Does it sound right? Or
yeah, I think we might think about maybe this is a stretch, but it's occurred to me that some of the initial analyses from Marxist feminism emerged around the same time that some of the new readings of Marx were emerging. And maybe that's less important than the fact that Marxist feminists initially, in distinction to social reproduction theorists, took the formless, let's say the kind of formless hidden abodes as their starting point, as opposed to labor. So how does that change in perspective? Perhaps we could talk about it as some kind of like underside, or not to be kind of deconstructionist about this, but some kind of dissociated position, dissociated from value. I know Roswitha Schultz has talked about value dissociation, and I think there is something in that for thinking critically about how value is formed and what gets recognized about how value is produced. So yeah, maybe there is. I think this can be a slippery slope though, because it also leads me to want to make arguments about how particular aesthetic forms or literary forms are able to advance forms of critique of capitalism based on sensory experience or affective experience that doesn't necessarily fall into the category we might call figuration necessarily. So these are questions I'm still thinking about. I wonder if Chris might have some thoughts on that too.
Also questions I'm thinking about. I guess my thought would be, does someone who takes up sort of this approach to critical theory sort of want the Lukácsian solution? Why does Lukács think it's important for the proletarian to sort of grasp totality? Well, it's so that totality can be seized, right? But in the case of sort of the approach to critical theory, I was sort of talking around today, I don't think it's the case that totality wants to be seized, right? Rather, it's sort of social relations themselves that need to be transformed. And I don't think it is, it would seem harder to do so by grasping and seizing that totality. Because at least if we follow sort of the traditional approach implied by Lukács, that means, sort of planning and distribution by the state, production sort of organized in roughly the same way. And if that's the case, does that lead to sort of emancipation from unnecessary toil, from misery, from unfreedom? And I'm not sure that it does.
Okay, maybe we should bring in a question from the, I think, YouTube live chat. There were two questions raised, and as far as I can see, they are both addressed to Amy. The first question, I'm reading what I'm seeing here in the chat. It says, what is the driving dynamic of social reproduction struggles if it isn't over a fair allocation of labor, that is, wages for housework, non-gendered distribution, or reproductive labor? Is it something like trying to opt for the least exposure to abstract determination over our lives by value, a sort of refusal of work politics? Question mark.
Yeah, that's a great question. And my answer would be, in short, yes. I suppose it is about the least exposure to capitalist abstraction, maybe. But that's too easy an answer, of course. And I think perhaps it's helpful to think in this context about the self-divided subject, or the ways in which a concept like antisocial reproduction, I think, can help us to think more dialectically about how we identify as subjects, how we perhaps identify with a particular identity category at the same time as we don't identify with it, perhaps, or we are forced to ascribe to certain modes of political representation or recognition models in the name of some kind of short-term goal, right? And in the process, of course, end up reaffirming that identity, you know, woman or whatever you want to place there. And I know that I should probably note that a lot of my thinking on these questions is indebted to Marina Vishmit's work and Zoe Sutherland's and Kirsten Monroe's work on social reproduction. And I know they've all been thinking about these questions too, particularly Marina Vishmit, who writes about the paradox of abolition as she sees it. So to kind of come back to that question, it will be to subscribe to an abolitionist politics, sure, which doesn't mean that union politics are a complete waste of time necessarily, or that going on strike doesn't work. We know that it can work. But I think this kind of commitment maybe to a different way of thinking about struggle for better social, not just better social conditions, but a struggle for what we might call liberation is something that might give us a bit more bravery maybe, or a bit more imagination that would help us to maybe say to each other, why don't we all go on a wildcat strike? Or why don't we refuse these hours that our employer is imposing on us? Is that such a crazy thing to do, to all just agree together to do that? And I think often we get a bit stuck in trade union politics, in making sure we're not difficult towards our co-workers. And I think that anti-social reproduction struggles and some of the struggles we've seen, particularly in the last year, of course, coming out of Black Lives Matter, most pertinently, can help us to refuse the kind of half measure, I suppose, of struggling for better wage work, right? And I'm sure everyone in this Zoom right now, at least, would agree with that too. I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you so much. We have two questions from participants in the Zoom meeting. There is one from Jacob Blumenfield, but Jacob wants me to read the question, and it's directed to all of you, Werner, Amy, and Chris. And the question is, what do you all think about the normative turn in contemporary critical theory today? I think that's an interesting question because probably all of your talks somewhere are related to it, because you seem to be somewhat skeptical of that. You could all turn your microphones on. I guess someone can jump in. Werner, do you want to?
Me? Oh, okay. So normative theory, I don't think much about it. It's the idea of freedom as opposed to the existence of freedom. It doesn't understand the force of freedom, and it seems to want to promise of a better world. On the other hand, of course, the attempt to civilize capitalism's treatment of the poor and miserable has an idea of normativity. There should be a better freedom, there should be a better justice, there should be greater fairness. So that's, in that sense, it has its justification, because it is the theory behind the is a theory behind the attempt to civilize capitalism's treatment of those who have to work for its profit. That's really what it is about, I think. That is its social justification. It is also the identification of what is wrong. When if there is the normativity of freedom, then clearly it is a normativity which declares that current situation is not freedom, it's somehow unfreedom or freedom restricted. So there's a critical edge to it. But the critical edge is quite constructive because it wants to make the is approximate to the ought, and it doesn't recognize that the ought in fact belongs to the society in and through which it speaks. And that would be my critique of the normative on the normative term. It would be quite important, I suppose, or interesting to see how this turn towards normativity, why it emerged or why it developed, and what are the social, as it were, relations, its social functions why did it occur in the first place? It's not the case that all second, third, fourth, God, how many generations of critical theorists they are, that they all subscribe to that. They just became the famous ones, as it were. And it would be important to understand what is the social logic, the social dynamic behind making this particular take famous and running with it and occupying university chairs and so on, whereas the other one exists on the fringe. And there must be an answer to that, not because of normativity or because it sounds good, but because of certain social dynamics which construct themselves in that particular manner.
Amy and Chris, do you want to jump in?
I guess I would just say that I have an article in Critical Historical Studies that just came out, and I have one in Science and Society that just came out that sort of, I think, argue for what I see as the blind spots in normative critical theory. And I think, that I think the blind spots it has is that it can't really sort of provide a compelling explanation of why society continues to reproduce itself in sort of the miserable manner that it does. If the norms are there, if people are reasonable, why is it that people do not simply come to grips with these reasonable positions and remake society in that way? Why do these approaches sort of continue to hold that society is developed in a progressive manner when it doesn't seem to me that it does? So I guess, if people really want to know my sort of more in-depth sort of criticisms of these approaches, I'd say check out those two articles. Email me if you would like them. That's sort of a attempt to sort of explain the matter quickly and crudely.
All right, good. We have 3 questions and comments from participants in the Zoom panel. Can we maybe bring, if those agree, can we maybe bring in Joe Giardini, I hope I pronounced the name correctly, Eric John Russell, and Pavlos Rufos. Maybe we can bring them into the Zoom so that they can raise their comments and questions directly to the panel. Would that be okay? Joe appeared. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. And there was Eric John also posed a question, and Pavlos. Okay, there we go. Why don't we start with Joe?
Thanks so much, Christian, Christopher, Amy, Werner. That was wonderful. My question's primarily for Amy, but I think it could move to everyone. But Amy, I'm curious, in your contribution to the SAGE Handbook, you drew a little on Rosemary Hennessy's work in Profit and Pleasure, and I take it implicitly Agnes Heller's in the background here as well, to think about the historicization of needs under capitalism, to develop a concept that you refer to as outlaw needs, as a driving force for existing in marginal relationships to contemporary capitalism. I'm curious how this sense of illicit or negated desire relates to the project of antisocial reproduction that you're developing, and how the historicization of need and desire relates to the historicization of experiences of misery under capitalism that Werner referred to. In some ways, this could be developed in reference to the earlier questions and discussions of psychoanalysis in relationship to capitalism as well. Thank you.
You have to unmute yourself, Amy.
Classic. Thank you, Joe. That's a great question. Yeah, how do we know what we need? And I think maybe antisocial reproduction will be, it's a project in process, but it will be hopefully a way to think about what's not even recognized as reproductive work. We all might think of reproductive work as work in the first place, and the essay The Logic of Gender makes an excellent point, I think, in insisting on calling reproductive work reproductive activities, in order to, remind us all of the point that it's not actually labor, it's not socially validated as labor. But yes, our project is an attempt to think about maybe what we might call doubly dissociated forms of reproductive activities. And I'm thinking of things like the experience of abuse, or the work that goes into recovering from gendered forms of abuse, perhaps. And I think ties to lots of questions, but questions that feminist and queer theory has long explored, relating to desire, but to how our desires are shaped, to maybe even the idea of the split subject. But to bring it back to Hennessey's idea of outlawed needs, there's a great study by Sam Solomon, which I think you know, Joe, but perhaps others don't. It's called Lyric Pedagogy and Marxist Feminism, which is a study of how feminist poets, mainly in Britain after 1945, were exploring in their work the existence of and perhaps the antagonism of what we might call outlawed needs, all those experiences and miseries that are not only not socially validated as real experiences, but have to be disavowed, sublated, or denied somehow. And so I'm trying to move towards, and I think this will probably be a project after this project, a way to think about how those things relate to value, or how we can connect a critique of value to critiques that we might say depend on what Beverly Best calls a neutral concept of ideology. So that would be the kind of critiques that emerge from cultural studies or from Stuart Hall's work, perhaps. That would be a good example. So yeah, it's very much something I'm thinking about. If you have anything to add to that, Joe, I'd be interested, or perhaps we could talk about this afterwards. But yeah, not sure if others have.
Yeah, we have two more. Eric, John, and Pavlos. Pavlos, do you want to go next? You have to unmute yourself.
Oh, I thought it was Eric John. Yeah, okay. Hi. Yeah, thanks a lot, everyone, for interesting talks. I just caught something that Werner said, and I wanted to ask something about that, because if I heard it right, I think Werner said at some point that politicization is a way of moving forward in terms of struggles and stuff like that. And I just wanted to ask what exactly is meant by that. How is like, what is politicization, and how does one escape from the formal side of politics? And I mean that in the sense that, you know, recent years, many of the struggles that have happened have been quite powerful precisely because they have avoided the official or the formal category of politics, which is one understood as, you know, the kind of the classical mediation that happens through political parties in parliament, mass media, trade unions, and many of the struggles that have happened in the last few years have gone much beyond that. So I was just wondering how exactly Werner defines politicization and how it relates to that kind of question of like formal politics and non-formal politics. And if it's not that, because I'm pretty sure Werner doesn't mean that, why is politicization the right term? Thank you.
Shall I answer that? No? Yeah? Okay. Look, the answer has to go a little bit in roundabouts. This can't be that direct, as it were. No? It has to look first at the character of political economy. And I give you a quotation, and the quotation is from Adam Smith. He defines political economy as a branch of the science of the legislator and statesman, i.e., he defines it as a political science, not as a science of the invisible hand, not as a science of entrepreneurship or whatever else it is. He defines it as a political science. So what is the character here of the political? In a way, I guess the character of the political is to prevent in the society, liberal economy, bloodshed and disorder, and to form characters so that the self-interested person does not, as it were, sabotage the production of his or her competitor, does not monopolize prices, does not do cutthroat competition, but competes only in order to facilitate the dynamic of wealth, which is a dynamic of ever-increasing labor productivity. And the political is required, the statesman is required, the legislator is required, the state is required in order for this character, for this entrepreneur, for the butcher, the baker, and the brewer, I think it is, no? In Adam Smith, to work towards only one thing, to compete on the basis of ever-increasing labor productivity. And there is the state to make sure that that is so on the basis of justice, on the basis of the rule of law, through a certain morality, the morality of the entrepreneur. So these characters, the butcher and the baker and all the rest of it, are not meant to use politics, political power. They're not meant to coerce. They're not meant to violate. They're not behave as political animals. So one could, there I see Marx's argument about the state as the concentrated power of bourgeois society in that definition of Adam Smith. It is the concentrated power of the logic of wealth in this society. It is the concentrated power of depoliticized exchange relations. It is the concentrated power of depoliticized relations of competition. It is the concentrated power that facilitates entrepreneurship. So far, okay? Now let's look at Max Weber's definition of the state. It's the holder of the monopoly of violence. That's what it is. It is the holder of the legitimate use of violence, which is always interpreted as if the use of violence has to be legitimized. No? People need to accept it. But it also means that there can be no other body in society that claims political power for itself. That is illegitimate. It is the only organization that successfully claims the legitimate use of violence. And by concentrating the political, it simultaneously depoliticizes the conduct in society. Conduct based on the Eden of human rights, equality before the law. Let's take the best possible example, equality before the law. liberty, utility, Bentham. So far, okay? So when I said earlier in my answer that maybe it has to do with the politicization of social relations, it means, in fact, to overcome the separation between state and society, to force the state back into society, to utilize the politics in society and not letting that be absorbed and concentrated by an outside institution. Now, you mentioned earlier, by implication, the events in Greece. One can add the events in Spain, where there was also great mobilization to, as it were, prevent dispossession, to prevent people who were unable to pay their mortgage to be thrown out. Huge social organization. And that social organization prevented state actors to do what they're supposed to do, namely to evict, to dispossess. So that's what I mean by politicization of the social relations. And but the way in which the system fought back, in inverted commas, was to by imposing upon that situation conventional, normal political processes. In the case of Greece, that was the process of a referendum, and it was the process of the party, Syriza. Once the party comes onto the agenda, the question is no longer, do I not vote, or do I vote for the party that promises to use the concentrated power of the state for the benefit of those who have been dispossessed? It at once, as it were, absorbed the political into an election campaign. That it later became the party that was most successful in imposing austerity upon the people it represents is a different question. But you can see how the politicized society, the society of the squares, the neighborhoods, the assemblies, how that was absorbed, that energy, by the conventional political process that was based on the distinction between depoliticized society and politicized state, and the party as the mediator in the middle. I'll give you another example of politicization which doesn't happen. I'm working at a British-based university. Every so often, the government asks its universities to submit to them, as it were, account of productivity. Who has published what? Is that what has been published, as it were, acceptable to the existing norms of what counts to be quality work? Of course, not every work is of quality. So what do the departments do as a consequence? Of course, they do that. Their income, their institutional rationality, all of that makes the department do it. You have colleagues who are unhappy with that, but they compete for their rating, right? Rather than do what Amy said, to not participate, to be not submitting, to not, as it were, put your work onto some university server where it then exists for assessment, where the question is inclusion or not inclusion. So what would the politicization of a department look like in that scenario? I don't think I need to define it for you. You can see it. It would be the refusal to participate and not the competition against each other for the better rating. Can you see what I'm after? Yeah, and that's what I meant by the politicization, to take charge of your circumstances, to challenge the conventional organization of the political, be it through the silence of administration or the silence of administration, or through the depoliticization of society for apparently political gain for those who are demonstrating. So that would be, as it were, one way to tell you, as it were, what I meant by politicization as a way of moving forward.
Very good. Thank you so much for that detailed answer. Amy, you want to also jump in?
Yeah, I was just briefly going to add to that, to what Werner was saying about the REF, as it's called, the Research Excellence Framework, where all our research is measured and funding from the state is doled out to universities in the UK based on the score that each department gets. In addition to that kind of stuff, we have in the UK the prevent policy, which I think needs bringing up here, which is a so-called counter-extremism policy that universities are obliged, they say, to enact or to abide by. And my university is now considering making all faculty undergo compulsory prevent training to learn how to monitor extremism in the university, which of course in effect means monitoring Muslim students. And so there are contexts like that too, where you kind of think, why don't we all, can we not, what if we all just refuse to do this? Because at the same time, of course, we've got this newsletter from the college about anti-racism in the university, and how our employers are furthering their agenda of diversity and inclusion. In the same breath, they want us to do this mandatory prevent training. I'm not sure exactly how those dynamics play out in US universities, where I think we have quite a few people who work at US universities in this Zoom at least, but that's just another example to add to that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Amy. We have a last question from the participants. That's Eric John.
Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate the discussion. My question comes from an earlier comment that came up earlier in the discussion regarding this issue of transparency, and as it relates to the fetish character, let's say. And my question is in part derived from these various comments you find in Adorno's writings. It's sprinkled throughout Minima Moralia, but you also find it in Dialectic of Enlightenment, where Adorno is talking about the kind of breakdown of the distinction between ideology and reality. He refers to it, in a number of different sort of registers in Dialectic of Enlightenment. It gives kind of coherence to this rationalized mimesis. It's in the culture industry essay. And my question then becomes, okay, if we sort of accept that there's something to this diagnosis, what does that mean for the fetish character of the forms of value? Does it problematize the notion that there is an obstruction of transparency, as came up earlier? Or is a quality like transparency sort of now, maybe with the diagnosis that we find in Adorno's writings after the war, is transparency something fully conducive to the fetish character of the economy itself? So just wondering how we, reconciling these two ideas. It's an open question. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Eric John. I think that goes back a little bit to what I also tried to formulate at the beginning. Good. I don't know, anyone of you could jump in maybe? It is kind of directed to all of you.
I guess I would just ask, are the instances in which Adorno sort of makes this move refer, in the same places where he says, totality cannot be grasped, all that can be grasped is sort of, the constitution of totality. And if that's the case, is this sort of a different question than the question of critical theory, right? Is the question of critical theory, the one, is it a question of sort of how have we created this reality? How can we transform it? And if the answer is we've created it on the basis of these social relations, and what we can see is sort of how we have created it, then what matters is transforming these social relations, sort of not seeing through the fetish character of the commodities. I guess would be my sort of contribution to the discussion.
Can I come in briefly? And
Yes.
I don't want to check out what Adorno means and whether he says something better in that text than in another text. I want to ask another question, back to you, Adolfo. If I criticize capitalism, what do I criticize? Do I criticize the way in which the economic categories move? Do I say, oh goodness me, they ought to have moved to the Eurozone, not to China? What do I criticize when I say, oh, there's too much profit here, there needs to be less? What is the critique of capitalism a critique about? Is it a critique of the economic categories, or is it a critique of the social relations that assume the form of those economic categories? I guess traditional theory would say, oh, it's a critique of the way in which the economy works, in which the market works. But what critical theory wants to make transparent, I suppose, is that these things don't actually have their own logic. Their logic is the logic of social relations, of specific social relations. And in order to overcome, in order to make these categories transparent, we have to gain an understanding of the social relations that constitute and assume the form of these relations. So it's a critique of the social relations, not the critique of the economic categories and the way in which the market moves. To put the same thing differently, if we go to the Feuerbach thesis, I don't know how many there are, but there's only one on praxis, that's the last one. All the others are about forms of thinking. And the most important thing there, well, what does it mean to criticize God? And you can't criticize God because God doesn't, you can't criticize that what you don't see. If God really were to exist, how do we know it's a woman or a man, a beard, no beard, a nose like that or nose, we don't know. You cannot grasp the invisible. So the argument there is the only way to make the invisible, to comprehend it, is to comprehend the human social relations that assume the form of God and are cowed by what they have assumed. God. That is the only way to make God transparent on his or her own terms. Nobody knows whether God is a man or a woman. Let's assume he's a woman, on her own terms. The struggle about what God means is a struggle between schisms, no? Between powers of interpretation, between that group and that group, in order to have God, to pursue their interests. And Marx says, no, that's not the case. Because that only is, in fact, God becomes a means through which you, to address, to pursue, to express your quite specific interests. So we need to understand the interests again. Yeah? So the transparency question is not to make God transparent, but to make transparent what constitute and is lost in the appearance of social relations in the form of God. And now back to Hegel. How does the appearance appear? It appears as cowed believers. No? That's the argument. And so, the question of whether this text or that text is better, I think it's very interesting, but it's very scholastic because it doesn't really address what critique has to criticize. What is critique about? How can I make the economic category of profit transparent? By showing its necessity as a form of certain social relations. No, I'm no longer talking about profit now. I'm talking about the social form of social relations. I'm talking about social relations. Do you follow? Do you see where I'm coming from with that?
I do, and I completely agree with what you're saying. I would just sort of ask whether or not, if we're following this sort of way in which social relations assume objective appearances, then that development of appearance, if we follow the Hegelian line, is in the transparency of necessity, right? It's the way in which our appearance, our social relations assume, with a very intense and loaded with suffering, kind of transparency to them, right? Things are as bad as they seem. And we can explain sort of why it is that the economic categories or the drive or certain sort of tendencies of accumulation, of course, have their basis in social relationships. And it certainly, I would agree that the job of critical theory to make that explicit. But the question was rather whether or not there is something about the objectification of our social relationships that has itself assumed a quality of transparency, right? So that, like, you know, the sort of bar that we drink at is also the same bar we see on the cinema screen or something like this, right? So this kind of critique of mass industrial culture that you find in Adorno. But I like your answer. I definitely agree with it. I'm going to mute.
Can I just add to Werner's really excellent answer there? Thank you for that. That I think we have to go elsewhere, perhaps, to think about transparency in terms of perhaps what Denise Ferreira da Silva theorizes transparency as the liberal subject. The liberal rights-bearing subject is the transparent subject for her. And she thinks about race in terms of affectability, on the other hand, in her book, Global Idea of Race. And Werner put it so well, so I don't want to add too much more to his point about transparency as an inversion, or the objective illusion of capital's thought forms, perhaps we could call it. But yeah, this is just to maybe reiterate some earlier thoughts about how the critique of value, as we know, can't do everything. And perhaps a thinker like Denise Ferreira da Silva helps with questions about transparency in this context, or can help you think about what happens when you go to the bar.
All right, thank you, Amy. We are a little bit beyond 2 hours, and the organizers proposed maybe that we should slowly wrap up. Are there any last comments from either the panelists or those who are in the Zoom meeting? Well, then let me repeat and thank Werner, Amy, and Chris for their papers and their contributions virtually. And then I am giving it back to Philip.
Yes, and let me thank you also, Werner, Amy, and Christian and Chris, and also everyone else who entered the Zoom room. This is a really rich series of dialogues that will be an enduring resource into any discussion where someone brings up Karl Polanyi or talks about good capitalism or bad capitalism. So we've now got the stuff to come back at them. And since a lot of our stuff is shared and seen by people who weren't there originally, this will be one that will be consulted like an encyclopedia, I predict. At any rate, the analytics will tell us. I want to quickly tell you what's coming later. So you can go out and have lunch and then come back and watch something on counterinsurgency policing. I don't know if anyone saw the statistic, but I think 436 people of color have been killed in America by police since that George Floyd was killed. So it's a panel I wish we didn't have to keep having, but we can't not have it. Tomorrow, Debt After Graeber at 11 a.m. What Just Happened in the evening at 3 p.m. Sort of looking at the last year's extraordinary events. Neither Settler Nor Native at 10 a.m. on Sunday, rethinking the I'm at 10 a.m. on Saturday, and rethinking the Chinese Cultural Revolution at 11 a.m. on Sunday. So a lot of good stuff. Please do contribute something so we can keep doing this madness, and enjoy the rest of your day.